Okay, so Tay Training. Tay Training is a training company that has a value base at its core, really, in terms of the fact that everybody that's a facilitator for Tay is an operational expert, or they've got connected experience. So you've got a wide range of different facilitators that work with and for Tay. And just again, we just put some examples up of some of the feedback that's been received from some of the courses that are run. Right at the end, we do have a slide that shows all the courses that Tay do deliver, and they've all had, they've all been received exceptionally well, and that's because of both our commitment to you and also the fact that we have that value basis running right through as the golden thread for all of the training courses. Okay, so today we're going to explore the 5 principles of the Mental Capacity Act, working with people in fluctuating capacity and multiple disadvantage, and I'm going to share some case examples from my own work. I'm going to look at the 3-stage test of capacity that's usually referred to as the 2-stage test. I'm going to look at the 4 elements for capacity assessment. We're going to touch on best interest decision, and we can only really touch on the changes to the Capacity Act, which are liberty protection safeguards. This really is just a very brief overview, and hopefully if we had more time with you, we'd want to go into much more detail of all of that. So as I said earlier, Tay is very much about using experts and tailoring the course to the needs of the customer. So therefore, if we were working with a drug and alcohol service, we would look at using case studies and using examples that are relevant to that field. And all the way through, we try to make it as engaging as possible. So even this is only 2 hours, we've got some interactive things planned, and we've got a case study where we're going to ask you to break off into groups, because we don't want death by PowerPoint. That's not how we deliver and facilitate learning. So accelerated learning, there's been a lot of research to show that people learn best when they feel all the senses are engaged. And I don't know about you, but I often doodle when I'm learning something new. And if you were in a face-to-face course with you, we would have brought loads of different tools and Play-Doh and different things for you to have a go at, because I honestly find that I take things in much better if my hands are doing something. So if people want to knit, if people want to doodle, if they want to colour something in, that's absolutely fine with us. And kind of there is a scientific basis to that it actually does aid your learning. So the ground rules, we've already said that we're going to be recording unless anybody had an objection, which people obviously haven't had because you've stayed with us. The ground rules, we would normally get you to do the ground rules, but as this is a really short course, we've just had to be proactive and say the ground rules are about being respectful to each other, learning in a way that people feel supported. The course is 2 hours. If people feel the need to go and get a brew halfway through, that's absolutely fine. You can turn your cameras off and just go and get a drink. As long as you can still hear what we're saying, that's absolutely fine as well. And it's about being respectful to each other's views. I would really appreciate if people could have the cameras on, but if people, just because it helps me to see if you're staying interested, sometimes people are nodding in agreement and that kind of fuels further discussion. If people feel comfortable, I would really appreciate it if people could have the cameras on. Okay, and then just the health check, and this is something that we do all the time, is working in social care and working with people is stressful. We understand that, and so this is just about looking after yourself as well. Particularly, we say this when we're delivering other courses, but any course can raise emotional issues for you, and if that's the case, look after yourself, go and have a break, You don't have to dash off to another meeting afterwards. Make sure you take time to look after yourself, because you're really valuable, and your organisation needs to value you as an individual with your unique set of skills and knowledge that you bring. Any questions? Okay, so this bit is about you introducing yourselves to each other, because you may not know each other. And this is about why you do what you do. So speak to each other, say what teams that you work within, why you chose to do the job that you did, why you're attending this training course. And if you feel like you can, when you come back and it's optional, just add in the chat function what your name is, what your role is, and any contact details for networking purposes. Because I don't know how big Southwark is as a borough. I don't know if you all know each other already. I've worked in large boroughs, small boroughs, where we all know each other. So that's just an optional extra if you want to do that for networking. Okay, so Becky, who's my tech guru, is going to now put you into breakout rooms just for 2 minutes to share the why. So why you're here and why you do what you want. And hopefully that empowers you and motivates you to sort of take in the most from this morning. Okay. Right. We're just going to, hopefully you've had the chance to sort of say your why and why you're here. And just while you're maybe considering putting your name, role and contact details in the chat function, we're just going to launch a poll really, so that we can get an understanding of what your knowledge is at the moment in terms of mental capacity, because I might then adjust some of the case studies accordingly. So Becky now with her IT knowledge is going to launch that poll really, if everybody's able to take part of it. And your questions are there. So it's, what is your current understanding of the Mental Capacity Act?
Give you just 5 more seconds to answer.
Yeah. I think everybody's answered. Well, most people, yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's answered now. Okay, so that's really helpful. So we've got some people are very new to the role, some people have got a basic understanding, some have got a good understanding. So we're sort of, we know where we're at. So that's really helpful. So thank you for that. Okay. So firstly, one of the things I want to talk about is multiple disadvantages. Sometimes we hear the word working with people with complex needs. Sometimes it might be deemed multiple disadvantages. And one thing I'd say is that people don't fit neatly into one service user group. So we don't, you know, you may get an older person social work team, or you might get somebody said they work in the recovery team. You don't generally get somebody that just neatly fits into one group like mental health services. Many people have intersecting inequalities. So they may be an older person with a physical disability, but they're also a victim of domestic abuse, or they have been a victim of domestic abuse. They may use substances to try and self-soothe and manage their underlying trauma. They may also experience mental ill health. There may be somebody with a learning disability who's at risk of homelessness, or they may already be homeless. They might have had involvement with criminal justice system, and they may have had their children removed and all the trauma that involves. So all of these other factors all impact on somebody's lifestyle choices and how they live. So often within society, we see people who've got all these interrelating needs, and we see them as making choices about how they live. And so many times I'll hear people say, well, they chose to live like that, or that's a lifestyle choice. And actually, we don't really look behind that to understand their capacity, to understand their decisions, or we don't sit back and actually try and understand the trauma that they've experienced that's made them or caused them to make those choices that they're making. So I think it's just really important that we don't have that simplistic view on, well, they seem to have capacity, so it's absolutely fine for them to make those decisions. And hopefully you'll understand a bit more of that as we go through the morning. So somebody's put something in the chat box there. Okay, so Angela's asked a question. Are you asking, do you have a written policy, Angela?
No, it was, sorry, I didn't catch the name of the lady that I was in the room with, but basically I was just explaining to her that I have a legal case of which a judge is challenging a social worker's capacity assessment and wanting a consultant to do one instead. And she was explaining to me, actually, a social worker's assessment should be adequate. Yes. So I just wanted something to go back and challenge the judge with, that was all, if it was something was around.
Okay, there isn't really per se. I mean, the decision of the judge should be based on the evidence that's presented to them, and therefore they would have to. I mean, has social workers, the legal department should have signed off that capacity assessment to say that it was fit for purpose, really. So it doesn't have to be a consultant unless it's a specific decision that might be relevant to a medical decision. Depends on what the decision is.
No, it's basically it's an antisocial behaviour related issue, and the judge is arguing that she doesn't believe that the perpetrator has the capacity to understand what's going on. Social service is saying, actually, well, yes, he does, and the judge is saying, well, no, he doesn't, and I want a consultant. So yeah,
a judge can do that. A judge can ask for a second opinion. You know, the whole point of the court of protection is
this isn't a point of protection. This isn't.
Oh, is it not?
No, this is just normal county court antisocial behaviour stuff.
Okay, well, I think it's really hard without knowing all the details to kind of get into a specific case.
Fair enough.
I think the social worker needs to go back to your legal department and ask for advice on what specifics the judge is asking for. And if the judge can ask for a second opinion, that's absolutely fine. And then the judge may want to consider, but if it's not in a court of protection, then it's not really the role of the judge to determine capacity.
This is exactly the point that was making.
It's not the role of the judge. In a court of protection, it would be the judge's decision about whether the threshold has been met in terms of capacity. However, in a county court, I would take that back to your legal team to question why they're asking for additional information.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Sorry about that. But it's important that we kind of understand where people are at. So I want to move on. I just wanted to make that point about, let's not be simplistic about capacity assessments. We have to look at the whole person and the whole person's journey to really understand why that person is making the decisions that they're making. And there'll be a whole history for each individual, which will inform their decision making, whether we believe that to be the right decision or not. I'm having a couple of problems here moving this on. So pre-training course, you were all sent information on how to join Slido. So the next question is, what does mental capacity mean to you as practitioners? So we've got a QR code, or you can join Slido using the code included. I think Becky's going to join us for a couple of moments and just take us through how to join Slido for those that are not familiar with it. Is that okay, Becky?
Yeah, so if you've got a smartphone, you can scan the QR code there that's on the screen, or you can go onto a web page on your laptop or device that you're on, and go to slido.com, and it will ask you to enter a code, which is that 938. And I'm going to very quickly change our screen so you can start seeing the Slido, and it will ask you to enter in what you think mental capacity means to you. So I will just change my screen. And don't worry too much, the Slido code will still be there as well once I bring that up. If there are any problems, please do let me know in the chat. And if you can't access it at all, but do want to enter something in, just let me know in the chat and I can enter it in for you as well. There we go. So again, the QR code there is there for you. Like I said, if you've got a smartphone, you can enter it, you can open your camera and it should just scan it for you, or you can go to slido.com. Let me give you a few minutes to do that. There we go, we've got some responses coming through.
Okay, so what we've got now is we've got ability to make decisions, having an understanding to make decisions, the ability to process your thoughts around decisions, whether a person's got the mental ability to make any decisions for themselves. So we've got some real varied answers here, but very much it's about assessing whether the person's got capacity to understand what you're asking them and understand the consequences. That's really important that we look at consequences. The capacity to make your own decisions. Somebody else has put in, assume a person has capacity unless proven otherwise, which I'm really glad you've said, because we're going to come on to that in quite a bit of detail. I'm really glad people have talked about capacity being time and decision specific, and that capacity can fluctuate. And again, that's really important that we understand fluctuating capacity, especially about people with complex needs. And the ability to make decisions for yourself with the understanding that you can weigh up options and risks. So people have got some people thought they didn't have much understanding of what capacity is, but you've actually summed it up really well in terms of the aspects of the capacity assessment you would need to look at. So I would say you've got a fairly good understanding across the wider group there. I think I've captured most things there.
You'll have to reshare your screen, Jackie.
Okay, right, that's great. People see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay. Having a bit of problems here, moving it on a little bit, sticking. So the next thing that I want to do is really just kind of ask people, what does a lack of capacity, do we hear that quite a lot? I'm looking at people, you know, we hear this very generalistic statement of Mary lacks capacity or Bill lacks capacity. I've just got to add that when I'm delivering training or I'm sort of working with anybody, I always use the words Mary and Bill, and that isn't to be stereotypical, but they're just people that I've used their names for such a long time. And it just, if you just bear with me. So I will see capacity assessments that social workers have wrote that'll say Mary lacks capacity, decisions made in her best interest, when actually that doesn't really mean anything, because actually, as you've already said, people can have fluctuating capacity, and people can have capacity in certain areas of their lives and not in others. So an example of Mary may be that Mary's living in a residential home. Mary has the capacity to decide what she wants to eat for her lunch. She has the capacity to choose what clothes she wants to wear. She doesn't have the capacity to keep herself safe. So therefore, in terms of some of the more difficult decisions in her lives, those decisions have been made in her best interest. So there are many different definitions of capacity. But the common sense one, and the one that's used most regularly, is that it means a person lacks capacity to make a particular decision or to take a particular action for themselves at the time the decision or action is needed. That's really, really important about looking at it being time and decision specific, because we can't have a decision that was made in 2013 for somebody and assume it's relevant today in 2021. We have to revisit capacity assessments because people's needs change, people's level of understanding change, depending on what's going on around them. Any questions on any of that so far? No. Okay. Right, this is, I mean, you've probably seen this before. This is used quite a lot in terms of explaining Mental Capacity Act in a really simplistic way, that people use sort of their hands to say that 1, 2, 3 is all about the person, and only if they don't have capacity will we be making those decisions in 4 and 5, principle 4 and 5, which I'm going to come on to now. Have people seen that before? It's just a really kind of simple way of kind of being able to explain it to people that you're working with. And again, we're going to come on to the 1, 2, 3s and the 4s and the 5s now. Okay. So principle 1 is everybody has the right to make their own decisions, and we should assume capacity unless it's proven otherwise. Now, I'm going to talk quite a bit about that because it's something that I find really, really interesting. Many reviews have taken place. SARS, do people know what SARS are? Safeguarding Adult Reviews. When somebody has died or been seriously harmed, then the Safeguarding Adults Board in Southwark and in all other boroughs will be required within the Care Act 2014 to undertake a Safeguarding Adults Review to understand why things went wrong. So every borough across all of the country will have undertaken different Safeguarding Adults Reviews, which I'll refer to as SARS, and these are opportunities to learn. Now, one of the biggest learnings has been around this assumption of capacity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that further, where we've made an assumption, but we've made it without taking into account lots of other information. So please keep hold of that. Yes, that's a legal requirement, that people have the right to make that decision for themselves, but hold on to that thought because it's not an automatic right. And I'm going to come on to that a little bit later. Principle 2 is people must be supported as much as possible to make their own choices before anyone can conclude that they can't make their own decisions. Principle 3 is about people having the right to make what others consider to be unwise decisions. Principle 4 is that anything we do on behalf of somebody who lacks capacity must be done in their best interest. And again, I'm going to talk a bit more about best interest. But principle 4 on your finger is what we do for somebody, but with them and with their best wishes and their thoughts and feelings right at the heart of the decision. and we must involve the person and their family and their advocate in that. And principle 5 is anything that's done for or on behalf of a person who lacks capacity has to be the most least restrictive of their basic rights and freedoms. This means that anything that you do for a service user who lacks capacity, you must choose an option that meets their best interests and interferes most leastly with their rights and freedoms of action. I'll just give you a really simplistic example. I work in mental health services, and sometimes we have people who are quite unwell, who may be experiencing a thought disorder and end up coming into hospital. So they're in hospital and they've come in on a section of the Mental Health Act. They start to use their phone quite inappropriately because they're getting quite disinhibited. The person starts to take photographs of themselves. They might be quite sexually explicit. And at that time, they have no understanding of the consequences of this. So they then start to share their photographs on social media. The nurses working with that person are very aware that the individual, when they regain capacity, when they've come out of this very acute phase of maybe mania, will be absolutely traumatized at what the action they've taken while they were unwell. However, the person also uses the phone to contact mum and dad, to speak to the nan every week. So actually what we wouldn't want to do in that situation is totally restrict the rights to family life by taking that phone away. So you might have a situation where a consultant says, right, well, I'm taking Mary's phone off her because in her best interest. But actually, as a social worker on the ward, you may want to argue, well, actually, that's not the least restrictive thing we can do here. What we may want to do is, we may want to have a support plan that enables Mary to use her phone with the support of others around her until she regains capacity to use her phone appropriately. Does that make sense? So in that example, what we're doing is we can demonstrate, because of the level of the mental illness at that point, that Mary does not have capacity to understand the decisions that she's making. However, knowing Mary quite well and knowing how important her family are to her, we do not want to restrict her liberties. So therefore, we restrict it to the level that's safe without totally depriving her of her phone and access to social media. Okay, any questions on any of that so far? Please ask questions, please chip in with your experiences. It makes it much more interesting for others.
Can I ask a question?
Of course you can, yeah.
You know, you said that the least restrictive would be to have someone to be with her. Then how do we manage when because I was thinking maybe at the time that she's hasn't got the capacity, it's probably best to block the social media sites, because then she wouldn't have access to go and take and post pictures.
Yeah.
If we're not going to do that, then how do we manage when she has capacity and she sees all those things on social media and get upset? Of
course you would, but we wouldn't. By when I say we would be restricting her access to a phone, because we would manage that with her. So with somebody who has cyclic patterns of mental ill health, when they're capacitated, you may have a care plan that states, when you're unwell, we agree that in your best interest, we will only use your phone for texting, or maybe you use the office phone for contacting your parents. So you'd have a plan in place, but sometimes these things happen without staff even being present. So it might be that somebody comes in on a ward and very, very quickly, in a sort of grandiose way or quite sexually disinhibited, is in their room using the phone. And we don't, as a matter of course, take people's phones off them. That would be a deprivation of their liberty. So yes, the person will be really upset, but we'll do everything we can to mitigate that situation. Does that make sense? Because what I'm talking about are situations where somebody has either been unwell in the community and posted things, where there's been no protective plan around them. When they've come into hospital, we haven't said, right, we're taking everything off you and you're not phoning your mum and dad because we can't trust you. What we would do is do it in the least restrictive way.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else got any questions on any of those principles?
Can I do the principle 3? The people have the right to make what others might regard as unwise decision. I guess everybody make unwise decisions, so
yeah,
even if they should still be allowed to do that.
Yes, that's right. So I've got an example. Bill has a history of depression. When he's depressed, he's demotivated. He doesn't really want to leave the house. He's no energy to pay his bills. So at that point, we'd have to question, has Bill got the capacity to manage his finances? But at other times, Bill may be making unwise decisions, but as a capacitated adult, Bill may choose to spend some of his benefits in the pub, knowing that that would leave him short of money for the rest of the week. So we have to then question, is Bill making that capacity because that's a choice that he's making and he understands the consequences? Or is it a decision he's making because of a mental impairment or an abnormality that's causing him to not be able to weigh up the risks? So I'm going to give you a case example very soon, shortly, of somebody making an unwise decision when they've got capacity and what the difference is. So we all probably, do none of you ever make unwise decisions? I'm sure I do. I'm sure when I go shopping, I'll buy something that I probably know I'm not going to wear, but I think, well, it's such a good buy, I'll have to buy it today. And I get home and think, why on earth did I do that? Now, nobody's going to stop me making that decision, but it probably wasn't a wise use of my money on that day. But we have that right to make unwise decisions. Does anybody want to come in with, but you're going to think I'm quite contradictory here, because I will say that when people make unwise decisions, we shouldn't just be accepting of that if we feel that something's not right. And that's where the Mental Capacity Act hasn't always been used appropriately, because we've gone in and said, well, we've got a right to make unwise decisions. We've made an assumption of capacity. But actually, everything about their life is telling us that actually they're living in squalor, they're not eating properly, they're not taking the medication. So there should be some alarm bells to say, is there something going on here that's impacting on their ability to make decisions? Okay. Principle 2 is really, really important, because I don't know if anybody has been involved in situations like this, is that when you make a decision, you do want all the information, don't you? Would you actually go into a bank and agree to a loan without understanding what your repayments were, what your interest rates were, how long it's going to take to pay it off? You probably would want to know all the information to enable you to make an informed decision. And that's what Principle 2 is about. It's about us supporting somebody to make a decision using their own choices. But we have to support them to do that. And I'm going to give you a case example of Mr. P, somebody I've worked with, where we went to absolute lengths to help him understand the consequences of his decision. Okay. Any other thoughts on any of the principles? Because these are your 5 principles that underpin the whole of the Mental Capacity Act. Okay. Right, we're going to get on to unwise decision making now. The fact that a decision is unwise is not sufficient on its own to conclude that the person lacks capacity. However, and I'm going to say however, or but, you could use the word but, should really be underlined. But it may be relevant to consider it in taking into consideration all the other information to determine whether a person is unable to make a decision. So a person who makes a decision that others think is unwise shouldn't be automatically labelled as lacking capacity, but sometimes we might have to question their capacity if other factors are making it seem that they don't fully understand the consequences. So I'm just going to give you a little example now of Mrs. M. So Mrs. M is a lady who's been a victim of domestic abuse for many, many years. And she's struggled with depression and anxiety as a consequence of domestic abuse. Her husband was abusive to her, her son was abusive to her, and then when her son moved out, his adult grandchildren, 3 grandchildren, all moved into the house. They used her house to take drugs. Friends came into the house to take drugs. None of them could actually get a housing in their own right because they'd been blacklisted by the housing association in the place that this lady lived. So it was a really, really complex situation. The lady was living in quite poor quality accommodation that wasn't really fit for her needs, and she'd become terminally ill. She was terminally ill, and she was taken into hospital because she developed pressure sores, which had caused her to have a bacterial infection. And when she was in hospital, she said, "I want to go home and die. That's what I want to do." Now, this lady was making an unwise decision. And in a sense, people questioned, well, does she really understand the consequences of it? Has her cancer reached a point where it's impacting on her cognitive impairment? Is she depressed? Actually, meeting Mrs. M, she was a very articulate woman, and she had a number of reasons for wanting to go and die at home. One was, it was a place where her daughter, who she was very, very fond of, had died of cancer, and she'd nursed her in that house, so it did have some memories for her. Another reason was her 3 adult grandchildren, who all had antisocial disorder orders against them, antisocial behaviour orders against them, were not able to live in another property. So if she did choose to go into palliative care or into a hospice, they would in effect be homeless. And even though they were less than kind to her, because of her history and looking at it through a trauma-informed lens, this lady had very low expectations of what she should receive from other people. So that was based on her long history of domestic abuse, and she wanted to die at home. However, when we sat with her and worked out what the care package would look like, because the one of the grandsons was known to the police, and there were weapons in the property, it did mean that very few people wanted to go into that property to support her in her hour of need. Some of the care agencies were saying, "We're not going in, it's a really dangerous place to go into." And so getting support for her was really, really difficult. She also had 2 Rottweilers, and the Rottweilers were a known risk to others, in particular to any professionals going into the property. And she said, "Well, it's okay because I'll let them out and I'll make sure they stay in the garden." But again, look, being honest with her and saying, "But you're now in a bed and you'll find it really difficult to get out of bed. How on earth are we going to safely get into the lounge?" She considered all of those different options. And once she knew that her grandchildren were going to be offered accommodation with a different housing association, that impacted on her decision making, and she did agree to go into palliative care. So that's an example of somebody that on the face of it, you might have thought, that woman lacks capacity. She's making a really unwise decision there. However, there was a lot of reasons why she was making those decisions, and she was supported to come with a plan that helped her, but also helped her to support her family. Does that make sense? Okay. So that does that make sense to you, Shireen, or do you need some, do you want, yes, it does make sense to you.
No, I was saying that's quite a very good example, really, because she's really showing by going through it methodologically why she doesn't actually go into care, and actually the offer of the grandkids going into housing actually put her mind at rest. So she felt safer and easier in a sense to go into
and this was
at home.
This lady has had a really horrific, you know, we talk about people with complex needs. She'd experienced, she'd lived in a family with drug use. The police were constantly being called out to the house because of criminal activity. Her grandchildren had been taken into care as children and now were living back with her. So a really complex family. And we can't just assume that that somebody lacked capacity because the decision they're making is not one that we would make. Does that kind of make sense? Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, I think when you look at unwise decision, you've got to assess it a bit further to really then find out if somebody lacks capacity or not. It's not just easy to like say, okay, they're making an unwise decision, they lack capacity.
Yeah,
it's not that straightforward.
Definitely. So just as a final point on unwise decision making, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about unwise decision making because as working in social care, this will be one of your real sticking points. The straightforward cases you'll sail through and you'll be fine with. It's this conundrum that's always difficult for people. So the Mental Capacity Act is mainly concerned with people who can't make decisions and about how we support them and make decisions in their best interest. And it's about whether these decisions are wise or unwise. The Mental Capacity Act is not about the right to make decisions generally. So there will be some times when people make decisions and we will have to question whether they have a right to do that as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in some of the other case studies. But please feel free to either put something in the chat function, which I'm getting through now. There's sometimes a little bit of delay on the chat function coming through. Or if people want to ask questions, that's absolutely fine as well. Okay, so I'm taking it that people nod, you know, if people feel that that's made sense. People okay with that? Great. So the other thing that I really want to bring home to you is this thing about unwise decision making being a lifestyle choice, in particular in relation to self-neglect. So this is something that I feel really, really strong about. And again, going back to the SARS, the Safeguarding Adults Reviews, in nearly 50% of the SAR, there's been a recent piece of research which has analysed 231 SARs. And in 45% of those cases, individuals died because of self-neglect, and there wasn't really the required level of professional curiosity. We made a judgment that somebody was articulate, they knew what they were saying, and therefore that was absolutely fine, that we could kind of enable them or step away and say it's their right, it's their lifestyle choice, and that sometimes it's much more complicated than that. So some of the questions that I want you to think about are, have we really been professionally curious? Have we really, really understood what that person's thinking, feeling, doing? Have we just accepted the rationale on first sight? Have we gone in with a bit of a tick box mentality? Or have we really been as curious as we need to be in terms of our duty of care to that individual? Are we really clear that the person can understand and weigh up the risks in relation to that particular decision? Can the person execute the decision? Can the person walk the walk as well as talk the talk? And I'm going to give you a case example now from my own career, if you will be good enough to allow me to do that. And I want you to ask questions and put things in the chat function as well. Okay, so the example of Mr. P. Mr. P was a gentleman who had a long history of mental ill health, but had been really, really stable for about 10 years. He also had, he didn't have a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder, but it was suspected that he possibly or probably was on the spectrum. Now, Mr. P had a history of self-neglecting, and he'd sort of moved from one accommodation to another accommodation. When things had got really cluttered, he'd sort of been given a notice period, and he'd found himself in sheltered accommodation. So he was living in sheltered accommodation because by this time he was in his early 60s, so he met the criteria for sheltered accommodation. And he went over into sheltered accommodation, and we got a call, or the district nurses got a call from the warden at the sheltered accommodation saying, we've really noticed that Mr. P seems really unkempt. He's walking around in sandals, and we've noticed that there's some sores on his feet. But when we've asked him about it, he's told us to go away. And we're just wondering if when you come out to do your routine calls to other people, whether you would knock at his door. So the district nurse knocked at Mr. P's door and said, it's just been brought to our attention that you've got some sores on your foot. We know that you've had diabetes in the past, and we just want to make sure that you've got good foot care at the moment. He literally told them to go away. He said, just go away. I don't want to talk to you. Go away. How dare you contact me? I've not agreed to speak to you. Right, okay. But they could see that his foot was weeping. So he had two sandals on, one foot had a sock on, one didn't. And they could see that the sores on his feet were weeping, and they were concerned that this would become infected. So they came back and spoke to me as a safeguarding lead to say, well, he seems capacitated. He seems to understand that he can say no to us. What do you think we should do? I said, well, I don't think you can just really on one visit assess somebody's capacity. And really, you need to build up a relationship, because there's a lot of evidence that working with people who have a history of self-neglecting, that relationship building is really, really important. And there's a lot of national evidence that's been conducted by Michael Preston Shute and Susie Bray to demonstrate that relationship is the key to supporting somebody with a history of self-neglecting. So I recommended that they went back again while they were in the sheltered accommodation in a non-confrontational way. So when they were back again, they just said hello to Mr. P. He came over and asked what they were doing, and they gradually built up a little bit of rapport with him. So I think on the third visit, they said they could go into his flat. They went into his flat, which was very cluttered, not many places to sit down. And they explained to him what the risks were of foot ulcers, particularly for somebody with diabetes. So they talked to him about this could become osteomyelitis, which would be like a bone infection, which is really, really painful. He was at risk of getting sepsis, and he was at risk of possibly of having his leg amputated. So they left him to think about all of that, and they went back. And he could talk the talk. He could say to them, well, yes, I know that I might have my leg amputated, but I'm not going for an x-ray. I don't want to go to the doctors for an x-ray. They offered him every way to support him to go and have an x-ray, because they needed to understand how extensive the bone tissue had been affected. And he could talk the talk. He could definitely talk the talk. He was a very articulate man, and he could explain as good as you or I why he didn't want any intervention. He understood what sepsis was, and he could tell them the signs and symptoms of sepsis. So if you were to say on a very, very superficial level, or even on a more complex level, this man most definitely could talk the talk. They gave him pictures of what it would look like if it went into his bone. They gave him pictures of what pressure sores look like when they become sort of narcotic. They gave him lots of information that he seemed to digest, and he seemed to be able to revert and tell them again. But he was very much getting at risk now of sepsis. So we said we'd like to, he had an advocate actually for other things in his life. And we did inform him that we were really concerned and we were going to have a meeting. And he agreed that we could hold a meeting and that his advocate could come to this meeting. We had a meeting, and actually one of the things we really did question is, although he can provide us with the information, and yes, but can he actually weigh up the risks? Because he seemed to be very, very fearful of going for an x-ray. And this fear in itself was so overwhelming for him that we believed it was colouring his decision making. So this man was so frightened of going for an x-ray, and we couldn't understand why, because he'd say, yes, I'm definitely going for that x-ray next week. So the district nurse offered to pick him up, to take him for x-ray. The x-ray was actually at the doctor's surgery. When she arrived, he'd say, I don't want to go today, I'm not feeling up to it. His advocate offered to go with him. So we did lots of practical steps to support him to get to this x-ray. And getting to know this man more helped the district nurses understand that he actually was quite fearful of going to the GP, because a long time ago he'd gone to the GP feeling anxious because his mum had suggested he went to the GP. And not long after that, he'd actually been sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And I don't know what the sequence of events were, because it was such a long time ago, we didn't have access to those records. So in his own mind, he'd made a very irrational jump between having somebody look at my foot ulcer and I'm going to end up on a psychiatric ward, because his fear was so great that it was colouring his ability to make a wise decision. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah,
it does.
Okay, I'm going to look in the chat function here. If people, yes, because we need to look behind sometimes what somebody's saying to us. And one of the things that's been criticised in assessments has been when people have used that tick box mentality. I asked Mr. P, did he understand what sepsis was? He said yes. Actually, so how can we prevent sepsis? Well, we can go for an x-ray, and that will help determine whether my infection has now got into my bones. I'm simplifying the physical and medical terminology for the purposes of this session. However, nobody then looked behind. So what is it that's preventing you from going for an x-ray? What is it that's stopping you walking the walk? And it was his underlying fear. Now, what sadly happened in this situation was, because his house was so cluttered, he was now at risk of being evicted again. And that really affected on his mental health. And he became very, very agitated and started to place himself and others at risk. And he was assessed under the Mental Health Act. And he did tragically end up being detained under the Mental Health Act. But actually, once he was on the ward, he was very, very compliant in terms of allowing staff to attend to his physical health needs, because I suppose for him that really horrendous fear that he had actually happened. And once he was in hospital, in a very different situation than would have been 30, 40 years ago. But one of the real positives in that case, and it wasn't positive that he ended up being detained under the Mental Health Act, and I've really simplified how that got to that point, is that the fact is, because the district nurses didn't just assume capacity, although they were originally going to do, and I was saying, I don't want you to at this point, I want you to build up a relationship with him, and I want you to understand what his blocks are. The physician that was treating his foot ulcers and his sepsis said if it hadn't been for the tenacity of the district nurses, he would have died, because what they were able to do is each week when they went to talk to him, they were able to check on his foot ulcers. They were able to dress them accordingly because he allowed them to do that over time. And they were able to prescribe antibiotics, which prevented the sepsis from really taking hold of his body. And there was a belief that he would have either died or would have had his foot amputated. So I'm giving you that as a case example of, let's not be really, I don't want you to go away and think, well, I can't assume capacity in any situation, but I feel we need to look a little bit deeper in these complex situations. If you've got somebody who's talking the talk, but isn't walking the walk, you may want to rewind a little bit and try and understand a little bit more about why they're making those decisions. Because in 44% of the SARS, this kind of thing was happening and somebody didn't question capacity. Yeah, so Declan's saying it makes sense. Shireen's saying that it makes sense. Anybody got any questions?
I'm really just not concerned, but I'm really glad that you've gone into the unwise decision a bit more, because when I've looked at a lot of capacity assessment, I don't think I see those things. And sometimes it'd be nice to see like a history, then you can really, I don't know, sounded proof that this person definitely doesn't have capacity, or it's just that they just, I don't know, because they're doing this, then
yeah, that's a really good point, because even though capacity is time and decision specific, we do make our decisions based on our thoughts, feelings, behaviours that have got a historical context, haven't they? So, you know, sometimes we don't always learn from our experiences and we do something the same way. And I just think we need to be mindful that we need to be professionally curious. We've got a duty of care. As much as if people have got human rights and a right to privacy, they've got their Article 5 right, which is the right to liberty, and they've got the Article 8 right, which is a right to privacy and family life. Somebody dies and a coroner will be asking, what about their right to live? Because that's a human right as well. Well, what have we done proactively to really understand what makes this person tick?
I think one of the points I'd like to raise is, in the way social housing is going now, the building the relationship thing is the challenging thing, because we don't really have patches anymore. No. So what you tend to find is they're going to be seeing lots of different people. So it's how you build a relationship with someone when you're not really seeing them that frequently. So that's just a point I'd like to make. That's
that's a brilliant challenge, Angela. And I think all social workers or anybody working in social care or health would say the same thing, that when I was first a social worker, we had the luxury of getting to know people. I know that social workers now don't have that luxury. It's very much, I think you can still, as in the limited time you've got, you can look behind the surface. So you can say, oh, so just tell me a little bit more about why you think that, or can you just tell me a little bit more about that, rather than just assuming something at first sight. And if you've got very conflicting information, it might be that you want to meet together with your other housing officers and compare notes, so that if somebody said something very different on each time that you visited, you may want to question, do they fully understand the information? Yeah, so I think you can do what you can do, and you can't do any more than that, really. Okay, thank you for asking that. Anybody else got any questions that they want to ask? Because it is a subject I find absolutely fascinating, and I'm just trying to guide you based on my experience and the cases that I've sort of been involved with. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'm going to move on. With my sticking this today. Okay, right, we've got the continuum. In law, there is no clear boundary, and that goes back to Angela's point before about a court saying, I don't agree with that capacity assessment, because there isn't actually a legal definition of what constitutes capacity and what doesn't. There's no clear boundary. It all appears on a continuum. So you could have capacity to make those decisions, but not those decisions. And you could sometimes have capacity somewhere in the middle. And it is a challenge for you as professionals, or for any decision maker, to choose the right level to set as the gatekeeping for decision making. So what I would be saying is, if it's about Mary having blackcurrant pie or apple pie, you don't need to record that decision. You're making that as a carer, as part of your day-to-day work that you're doing. But the more serious the decision, the greater the evidence. So going back to Angela, your case with the social worker who's presenting information for court, if that information is going to seriously impact on the person's liberty, then you need a very detailed capacity assessment. So that, and I think the legal team there need to be able to sign that off to say that it's fit for purpose. Yeah. Okay. So that's my ballpark figure. Is the more serious the decision, the greater the evidence, because if we are depriving or restricting somebody's liberty, we've got to really evidence-base that. And it's not good enough to just put in records like capacity made decision in best interest when it's a decision that impacts on somebody's well-being. Okay. So fluctuating capacity, and we've talked a little bit about fluctuating capacity already. If you work in the criminal field, your balance of probabilities has to be beyond all reasonable doubt. So you're looking at a very, very, very high threshold in criminal law. We don't work in criminal law. We're working in civil. We're working in civil, cases, if you like. The Mental Capacity Act is a civil act, if you like, not a criminal act legislation. So it's got to be on the balance of probabilities, not beyond reasonable doubt. It's beyond the balance of probabilities. So that is 51%. So as a practitioner, you only have to be 51% sure that somebody lacks capacity, and you might have a doubt of 49%. So you don't have to have a 90% surety. You just have to be a little bit more sure than not. And one of the things about fluctuating capacity is, if you're working with somebody who's drug or alcohol dependent or uses substances regularly, they will have times when they lack capacity. And one of the important things might be that you share with them information so that they can make an informed decision at the point that they've got capacity. And I'll just give you a really brief example of that. If you're working with someone who periodically needs to go into hospital because of their mental ill health and they've got children, when they're capacitated, they may say, I want my mum to look after the children. My mum's got a really close relationship with the children, and the care plan that I want is mum to look after them, to move into my house so they can still go to school. That's a capacitated decision. When Mary becomes really unwell and becomes thought disordered, she may believe her mum's an alien and that the worst thing for the children would be to be with an alien. and therefore she doesn't want mum anywhere near the children. However, what we've got here is she's made that decision when she's capacitated, and that's a decision that we'll be respecting. So that's one of the advantages with fluctuating capacity, is we can make that decision while the person is capacitated. Now, there may be some times when they are incapacitated and an emergency decision needs to be made. It might be about hospital treatment, and that decision is lawful because the person, regardless of whether it's drug or alcohol use and it's short term, you might have to make a decision. But if it's a decision that can wait, it should wait. Okay. I'm going to take you on to a complex case discussion now. And what I'd just like you to do really is, we're going to go into breakout groups just for 10 minutes, just to discuss this case. So first I'm going to talk you through the case. Right. Peter's a young man who's got severe mental illness. He actually suffers from bipolar. And he's very recently been diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder. He's been living alone and he's been using drugs on and off for a few years. When he uses drugs, it impacts on his ability to manage his mental health medication, and he stops engaging with services. His use of drugs impacts on his understanding of the risks to his mental health, and he doesn't then attend for his regular depot injection. Although when he's capacitated and he's not taking drugs, he meets with his care coordinator regularly and always very actively engages with services. The other bit, which is the safeguarding part, is he's recently been exploited by drug dealers who are placing pressure on him to take out phone contracts on their behalf, and his debt's now risen to over £10,000 and it's climbing. He's now at risk of being evicted because he's been deemed by his landlord in social housing as having the capacity to make unwise decisions. Now, what happens with this young man is, because of his ASD, his autistic spectrum disorder, he's quite socially isolated and he struggles with social communications. And he sees these drug dealers as friends. And when they say, we've got you a cracking telly, something that they've just bought from cash converters for £10, and we'd like £500 for it, he has no awareness that he's being exploited. And every single time he gets his benefits, they turn up on his door. So he's making lots of decisions at the time that then leaves him with no money, is at risk of being evicted, he's at risk of his mental health declining, and he's got no money for food at times, he's got no money to pay bills. So what I'd like you to think about in small groups is what information you want to gather to assess his capacity about his medication and decisions about his finances. So just in small groups, there's no right and wrong answers here. What would you need to know to help you? Because his social housing manager believes he's got the capacity to make unwise decisions because he comes across as very articulate when he's feeling well. And they don't really understand the fact that he's making some of these decisions under duress because he wants to be friends with these people and he's actually quite frightened of them as well. The police can't do anything because they deem him to be participating in this activity. So we're going to break into small groups now, and you've got 10 minutes maximum, and then we'll bring you back. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you. All breakout rooms are open now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're just waiting for everybody to come back from the little breakout rooms. So would people like to just
Not
share?
everyone's back yet, Jackie.
Okay, just wait. Who's back?
Everyone should be back now for you.
Okay, so everybody's back. Can see everybody's now. That's great. Would people just like to give any feedback on that, or any information you feel you'd want to know about to be able to help make decisions? I don't want to put people on the spot.
No, that's all right. I don't mind starting.
Okay.
So I was working with Angela and Clara, and we kind of broke it down into different groups. So please do, Clara and Angela, pipe in if I miss anything or you want to add anything. But we thought like it'd be a safeguarding inquiry raised under the section 42, the Care Act. And we spoke about the drug taking and kind of maybe exploring where this all started from. Yeah, it's been taking it for a few years. Where did it all relate for and why? And would he be interested in detoxing and maybe kind of like exploring the drug taking and maybe referring to some other organisations that will be able to help support that maybe also can work with the dual diagnosis. And then looking at debt, we thought was a big thing. So keeping in the drug side, does he have any debt to the drug dealers? Which I'm saying could be quite bullyish for the dealers, and they can, if you're a drug taker, you tend to know certain roads and areas where you can hang out with other people with common interests, and the dealers know to hang there too. So it would be interesting to know as a protection point, does he owe them any money? If so, how much? And then we kind of looked at the medical. So looking at, actually going back to the housing, sorry. The Angela made a point that he would be close to cuckooing. Potentially, not quite there yet because the dealers haven't moved into the property, but he could be cuckooed. And then looking at his £10,000 debt as well, where that comes from, and having a breakdown of what companies, for example, council tax or EE phone company, sometimes you can explore getting the debts reduced because of his mental health, maybe setting up a payment to pay it off over a period of time to help take some of the pressure away to him. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else, Angela and Clara, that you want to say. I'll mute myself.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is that we'd probably look at some sort of closure order on his property as well, to stop, just to create a safe space, and then maybe even if we can't put him somewhere permanently currently, but just whilst we're doing the assessment, put him somewhere for a short space of time to buy some breathing space while we decide what the long-term solution is.
That's brilliant, because I think what you've picked up there is the protective elements in terms of the safeguarding. And even though this isn't a safeguarding course, actually there is a safeguarding element to many situations that we work with. We work with people with complex needs. So I think there's partly that, but also it's not as simple as he has capacity or he doesn't have capacity in this situation, because part of why he's choosing to hang around with this gang is because he's got very little social interaction with other people because of his diagnosis of ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. And that's unique to him. I'm not saying that that's unique to every, that's different in every person. So that is an element that places an additional risk. So to mitigate that risk, we'd want to kind of look at other social activities for him, other experiences, and the offer of like a drug rehab or a sort of a substance misuse support group or whatever that may be. And again, it's about getting to the nuts of, does he really understand the consequences of his decision making? And I think I shared that to illustrate it's not as simple as, yes, he may do, no, he doesn't. So what about anybody else? Has anyone else got any feedback from their group? Or information you'd want to gather, or any thoughts at all? You got anything?
We talked about maybe speaking to his social support worker to get like a better understanding of how he is when he actually has capacity to be able to understand if he's able to make decisions around his medication and finances, and even
Yeah.
going into detail about the debt, what a debt is, what the risk of having a debt will do to him, explaining how, not even explaining him, giving an explanation about what it means about eviction and stuff like that, to find out if he really, or even friendship, because everybody else viewpoint about friendship or different, and then from his answer that, then we can probably go into how these people are not exactly his friends per se. They're just probably using him to get up these things. But we felt it was a very hard case, very complex case.
And I think that's the reality of the world we live in now, isn't it? That cases are becoming more complex.
Yeah.
I would not have had a case like that 29 years ago in social work, but you would today. One of the real important points of this case was about if we deemed it not to have capacity to manage his finances, because he struggled with consequences, he struggled with, he was very impulsive in his decision making. One of the things that could have been considered was an appointeeship, so that the local authority took over the financial control, which placed him at less risk of going into further debt. That would be an option if he was deemed to not have capacity. But again, we'd have to get to that point. So we would want to look at what could we do to mitigate the risks but still ensuring that he was at the centre of all the decisions. Any final points before we move on? Because I'm just conscious of time. It's only a really short, it's just a really short session today. Okay. So I've already mentioned about learning from Safeguarding Adults reviews, and I've said that typically lack or poor quality mental capacity assessments is a consistent theme in all of the reviews that have happened. Frontline staffs often work with adults who are not judging their own well-being very well, and sometimes they make unwise decisions that don't promote their own well-being. One of the challenges for us as workers is to ensure that the Care Act rights, because we've got the Care Act 2014, gives us all a right for our well-being to be promoted. But how do we square that when we believe that the Mental Capacity Act gives us also the right to refuse services? And remember that the well-being principle is enshrined in the Care Act 2014. So if you're doing a capacity assessment and you deem someone to be capacitated to make an unwise decision to live in squalor, have you considered also the Care Act in terms of the right to well-being and to be supported from a strengths-based approach? So it's just, I know this isn't a training about the Care Act, but I just wanted to, you know, that's another dilemma that you've got as workers, really trying to balance those rights of the individuals against the risks of harm. And I do, you know, if you've got time in your staffing groups or you want to sort of know more, they're the kind of things that we should be thinking about. Any questions on that? No, it's just food for thought. So when do we assess capacity? If people can either shout out or put the answer in the chat function, when should we be assessing capacity?
I suppose on all my assessments that I do when meeting clients, because like you said, the capacity can fluctuate. So yeah, always for me.
Yeah, always. So yes, so Angela said always, yes, definitely. So that's really important that we all consider capacity in everything that we do. So that's what I was looking for there. Anybody else got anything else to add there?
We often maybe just look into it when there's a certain risk associated, when you're with a case, when there's maybe family raising concerns, and you always take that into consideration with concerns around someone needing support.
I think somebody's got some background noise going on, if they're able to mute at the moment. Yeah, I think that's right. So what I want to then say is, well, once we've decided we do need to assess capacity, just have another look in the chat box there. Yes, exactly. When carrying out assessments, Nazim said when we have got reason to believe that they lack capacity, absolutely. So going back, Nazim, to what we said earlier, we don't have to be really, really, really sure. We just have to, on the balance of probability. So we have to have some reason, and it might be 51% is what we'd kind of said earlier. So just moving us on again. Again, going back to this point about capacity being time and decision specific, I've just left you some really simple guides here about what to have for lunch. We don't have to really do a capacity assessment. If it's a complex decision or it's a high consequence decision, it might be somebody moving accommodation, we should have a detailed capacity assessment. And if an assessment's required, we should always involve the family and the person, of course. Now, it might be that the person's got advanced dementia and they're not able to take part in the decision making, but you might want to speak to the son, the daughter, the wife, the husband, and you may want to ask, so if Bill was able to say what he wanted, what do you think he'd say here today? And it's about understanding what the wishes and feelings would have been. And that's really important to make best interest decisions, really, is at the heart of the mental capacity assessment, that the decisions we make on behalf of others are made in their best interests, as we would want it to be done for us. The other part is, if there's a disagreement about either the capacity assessment or the outcome of assessment, you need to escalate that and you need to seek legal advice. And at sometimes it might need to be referred to the Court of Protection. We haven't got time to go into that now, but that's something else that's part of the Mental Capacity Act, is the Court of Protection can make overriding decisions. So just that we're going from really straightforward decisions like what you're having for your lunch to massive decisions where there's a disagreement in relation to capacity. So it might be that there's if a decision cannot be reached, then it ends up in Court of Protection. But before you get to that point, you'll be seeking legal advice within your own organisation. I'm just going to very quickly take you through the three-stage test of capacity that many people refer to as the two-stage test, when actually in law it's actually 3 stages. So the first bit is there an impairment or a disturbance in the function of mind or brain? Please be aware this can be temporary. So this could be drug induced, it could be alcohol induced, it could be someone's had a seizure, it could be somebody's is traumatized because they've had a road traffic accident and they've become quite concussed. So it can be a very short-term impairment, doesn't have to be a permanent impairment. And it's really important because often if someone's picked up and they're under the influence of alcohol and they say, I'm not going to the hospital, the ambulance service will say, oh, I have no right to take them, but actually they can make a decision under the Mental Capacity Act in those situations. The other part is the impairment or disturbance sufficient that the service user lacks the capacity to make a particular decision? So just because you've got an impairment doesn't mean that it impacts on your ability. So that both of those need to be present. And then the third part is the causative nuance. Have people heard of that? So in 2013, the Court of Appeal emphasised that the impairment must not merely be present alongside the functionability, but it must be the causal link. So that's what the third part of the capacity assessment is. It must be the connection between the two. That's what causative nuance means. In other words, you must be satisfied that the person's inability to make a decision is because of an impairment or disturbance of mind, and you must be able to evidence that. So, for example, going back to Mr. P, we believe that Mr. P could not make a decision about having his leg ulcers treated because he had an underlying thought disorder, and he believed that any interventions involving health professionals he would end up in a psychiatric hospital. So that's evidence linking the fact that he's got an impairment and it impacts on his decisions. But you've actually provided the information to show how one links with the other. Does that, any examples of that? I've just given you an example of Mr. P, but there can be many different examples of that. So it's not enough basically to say Mary's got dementia, so therefore Mary can't make a decision for herself. We have to be able to evidence that the dementia, the cognitive impairment, is preventing Mary from making a decision because of her short-term memory loss. She can't remember to keep herself safe. So it's about making that connection between the decision and the impairment. Any questions on that? Can you not see the current slide? Can you see the slide, everybody? Yeah. Does that make sense to people about the connection between 1 and 2? We've got a few more chats coming in. Yes, it does. People are saying it does make sense. Thank you.
Sorry, I only saw 1, as in, does the person's got impairment? I didn't see stage 2.
Okay. All right, stage 2. Okay, let me go back. Not letting me go back at the moment. Okay, so is there an impairment or disturbance sufficient that the, can you see that part now?
Yeah, now I can. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's no.
Okay. Yeah,
right,
that's
okay.
fine. That's fine.
So that's about making that connection, really. And again,
can I just ask something?
Yes, of course.
In the whole instance of dementia, then you can't then just use dementia as saying somebody hasn't got capacity because they've got advanced dementia. Is that correct?
No, I'm not saying that. What you need to say is you need to be satisfied that the fact that they can't make the decision is because they've got dementia. As long as you can demonstrate that, that's all you need to do. So for example, you could say Mary has advanced dementia. One of the things that Mary's unable to do is recall details and weigh up risks. Therefore, her inability to make a decision is due to her underlying dementia. So you just have to connect 1 and 2 together, and that's what makes it a 3rd stage test. But a lot of people are not aware that you have to demonstrate that connection. Only if I mean, for it to be stood up in court, you would need that, most definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So do I need to explain a little bit more about that connection? People needing a little bit more about that connection. So I've just given you that example of somebody with dementia. Does that answer your question? Yes, it does. Okay.
No, sorry. Just to explain more about the 2 can lead to the 3rd.
Sorry, can you say that again?
How the 2 connections, how they can lead to the 3rd. That's what I was asking to explain more.
Right.
About.
So somebody's got a diagnosis of dementia. That's part 1, right? Part 2 is that diagnosis actually prevents them from making a particular decision, right? So that's part 2.
Yes.
3rd part is not really a test. It's just that you're showing through your assessment that both link together. So you're not saying things like Mary has dementia and cannot make decisions for herself. You're actually being a bit more specific to say Mary has a diagnosis of dementia. Her level of dementia is at a severe level. She has no ability to retain information and recall the information provided to her. Therefore, this is evidence that she's unable to make that decision for herself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's how I understood it before. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to leave this last bit because we've actually already covered it. We've already talked about the capacity in terms of when we need to make those decisions and when we don't. We've already covered that bit. So I've given you some examples. Obviously, I've already said to you that the more serious a situation, or the more serious a decision, then the more we have to think a bit further and a bit wider about the consequence of that decision. So who else should be involved? Well, we should be involved in family, friends and carer, anyone who can help that person feel more comfortable. So in the case of Mr. P, we involved an advocate because he had a very difficult relationship with his mum, and his mum was not somebody who would have aided and assisted his decision making. If the person has got no friends or no family, and there's only paid carers that are involved, then we should be looking to appoint an independent mental capacity advocate called an IMCA. That's enshrined within the law, within the Mental Capacity Act, that we need to ensure that people have advocacy. Again, if it's a really serious decision or it's got serious consequences for the person, we should be asking specialists. Going back to Angela's point, that might be why the judge is asking for a specialist. It might be a neurologist, it might be a mental health psychiatrist, could be a psychologist. It might be that they want expert advice on why that particular impairment is impacting on that person in a particular way. Okay. And lastly, as I've already said, when you've got a really serious decision which involves a deprivation of liberty, or when families disagree with the decision that's proposed, or there's a disagreement between parties, then it's referred to the Court of Protection. Again, we haven't got time to go into the details, but that's just layering it for you in terms of how the decisions are made and who we should involve. Okay, so we've already talked about best interest decisions, and we've said, you know, the decision maker might be a carer. If it's a more serious decision, then we're asking that to be a healthcare professional or a social worker, or it might be a consultant. And if you're assessing capacity, some of my top tips would be provide pictures and leaflets to people, make it easy to understand. If we're saying to somebody, you could get pressure sores if you're not careful. What's a pressure sore? To most people, they don't know what one is. Show somebody a picture. If you're asking somebody about moving into sheltered accommodation, show them pictures, take them to see sheltered accommodation. We can't really expect someone to make a decision if they don't know what the information is. And we've got a duty to provide that informed information so that they can make a decision. It's really important. Consider the environment. If you're working with someone who's alcohol dependent, perhaps the morning's the best time to meet with them before they've gone to the pub at 11 o'clock, or maybe even earlier. Find out when the best time to meet somebody is. Does the person need an advocate? Do you feel that they can understand the information? Ask them 5 minutes later, did they retain the information? You need to be specific. So you might want to put in your assessment. I asked Mary, did she understand why she was living in a care home? And she said, yes. 5 minutes later, I asked her the information again and she didn't understand what I was asking her. So, you know, repeat the question so that you've got that evidence base. Help people weigh up decisions and help people weigh up the information and understand the consequences. Going back to Mr. P before, some people are very good at telling you a story and they can talk the talk and they're very articulate. They can say what they want, you want them to hear, or they will say what they think you want to hear, but their mental health might be colouring the decision making, or the trauma they've been through in their life might colour their decision making. Communicate the decision, whatever the decision is, record it, and record it in their words. So whatever words they've used, you put that down to help illustrate the decision that they've made. It's not acceptable to use blanket decisions like patient lacks capacity, and make sure that you're using your MCA documentation that's correct for your organisation, because that will help provide evidence in the case of a civil or a criminal case, or if there's a complaint at a later time. So find out what your MCA policy is in your organisation and what the assessment tool looks like, if you have one. You should all have one. We've got much more to discuss, and if we have much more time, and if this was a day's training, we'd look at executive decision making in more detail, we'd look at the best interest process, we'd look at the role of independent advocate, we'd have some case studies, and we'd look a little bit more at liberty protection safeguards, which are the changes in the Mental Capacity Act. But we haven't got that time, sadly, with you. It's very limited, and we are running out of time at the moment. But I think you've been provided with this poem, and I would like, I don't think we're going to have time to go through it, but we will share this poem with you. And this is an example of a man who was deemed to have capacity to make unwise decisions, and he drank himself to death. And this is a SAR from Kirklees Council, and it's called Adult N. And it is a really, really good example of how somebody's thinking has changed through the use of alcohol. So we want you to take this away and read it and kind of consider, did that man truly choose that life, or was that life chosen for him because of the trauma he'd experienced in his life and some particular situations? So again, it's just an example of somebody was deemed to be able to make decisions for themselves. They were seen as disengaging, difficult to work with, and tragically they ended up dead. Again, just repeating what I've just said, you need to know where to look. You need to know your Mental Capacity Act, the CARE Act. You've got a code of practice to support legislation. Find out what your local safeguarding board's policy is on MCA, and find out what your department and organisational policy and procedures are. So again, just one last thing. Can you tell us what your top takeaway is from today? If you could use Slido again, that would be really, really helpful. Just to say what your 5 principles, which of these elements have been your main takeaway from today. I've put the 2-stage test in to give you a bit of a nod to say we now know it's a 3-stage test of capacity. So if people would just spend a moment doing that, that would be really helpful. And I'll read some of these out as we go along. Okay, general overview and recap, which is going to help me when I carry out an MCA assessment next week. Empathy, dig a little bit deeper and don't make assumptions. I love it. Yeah. Don't make assumptions is really important. Thank you. The 3-stage capacity test, it's been informative. The principles, unwise decision making, it's been informative. Fluctuating capacities, something that somebody's taken away from this morning. Unwise decision making. Somebody else has talked about MCA and how we need to use it alongside the CARE Act and that wellbeing principle. I'm really glad that you took that away from today. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. We've only got a couple more slides. Sorry. So just really about the impact of empathetic work. Sometimes it does affect us, and it's important we look out for each other. And one thing that's really important is if you've done the best within all of your constraints in your role, that is all you can do. And if you go on any of the Tay training, we talk quite a lot about empathetic work and the importance of looking after yourself, because that's one of our core values, is about looking after us and looking after you as practitioners. So look after yourselves, debrief, reflect on the impact, relax, recognise your limitations, recognise your professional boundaries. And if you want to, you can look at the podcast, and it's about key workers sharing their own experiences of burnout. It's very good. I've looked at it, and it gives some tips on how to avoid getting to that point where we feel that we are burnt out. We also, what the founder of Tay Training, Tammy Banks, has actually got a book, Transform Your Training, which is fantastic, and it's here to help facilitators, service users be the best that they can be, and that is available on Amazon, and the links are there at the bottom of the page as well. And lastly, the Tay Training deliver a range of CPD accredited training courses, all of them. There's too many to speak of, but there's domestic abuse, safeguarding alerter, working with people convicted or at risk of causing domestic abuse, hate crime awareness, many courses that are relevant to all of you, and all of them are delivered by operational experts who want to engage with you and are values led. So I'm just going to check the chat box. The slides and the recordings are going to be sent out to everybody next week. And in that, I'd like you to just spend a moment reading the poem that this man had read. And I think it'll be really good to read it and try and consider the impact that that has on you, to not make assumptions and not assume that somebody makes those choices as a lifestyle choice. There's obviously something much more complex going on there. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time and hope this has been useful, and this recording is going to go out much wider. So thank you very much for your contribution. It's been great spending this time with you this morning. Okay. Thank you for a great session. Thank you. Thank you very much for taking part. Thanks. That's lovely. Thanks for all those positive comments in the chat. Thank you. We've really enjoyed being with you this morning. And Declan's found it really useful as well. Thanks very much to everybody. Thank you.